typical state of the art for a quantum computer is around 100 qubits. We need 1 million. And as yet, over 3 decades later, there is not a single known quantum algorithm where you can say this specific classical algorithm would be cheaper to run on a quantum computer. Not one. And yet, everyone is convinced they're going to make so very much money building a quantum computer. In my mind, humanity clearly wins when we work together. And unfortunately, that is not the path we took when it came to where do we get the money for quantum computing. The number one reason that I'm not working at Google anymore is because I put my foot down and said, no, we're going to do this research open source, and I'm not going to negotiate on that. And they were like, well, that's fine, but you can't do the open source research here. It would be much better if the field was run more like CERN, more like IDA, more like the International Space Station was run, as a global international collaboration of academics that will most definitely share everything. You've got hundreds and hundreds of groups around the world all trying to do very overlapping research. And it is extremely difficult to see how all of that money spent on all that duplicate research could ever possibly be paid back.
Today's guest is Austin Fowler, one of the leading architects of quantum error correction and a pioneer of the surface code used in today's quantum computers. In this conversation, he explains why building a scalable quantum computer is a decades-long challenge, what it really takes to make qubits reliable, and why open collaboration may be the key to unlocking the quantum future. Please welcome Austin Fowler.
Cool. I would argue not every research field is a quick nail it in 5 years and win. In fact, I would argue more and more research fields these days, as technology becomes more complex, do take decades, lifetimes, whole careers. Certainly quantum computing is one of those technologies. It's not going to be done quickly. It's going to take many, many years before we have things that can do what we dream of doing. So it was always intended to be a marathon, not a sprint. In the early days, we didn't even have single qubits that worked well. Right now, we've reached the scale of maybe 100 qubits that work well. But to get to 1 million qubits that work well, it's not going to be 5 years. It's going to be a lot longer than that. So you have to have a mindset of enjoying the progressive technical challenges, both theoretical, experimental, as the technology evolves.
You're saying it's a long path towards the... what are we aiming at, first of all, like in quantum computers?
General ballpark goal depends on the architecture. If you are talking about a chip that only has an array of qubits with nearest neighbor interactions, you need more qubits. So maybe of order 1 million, at least 100,000 to do something useful. If you have more power than that, if you can do long-range interactions, it's a very open field of research as to how low you can go and still do something useful. Hopefully significantly below 100,000, maybe as low as 10,000 qubits will be enough to do something useful. A lot will depend on the fidelity of operations and just how arbitrary your interactions are as to what codes you can use, what compression techniques you can use, and how far that can go. There's a lot of active progress in that area. We will see how low it can go, but we're not likely to go lower than tens of thousands.
So it's like, for example, Shor's algorithm is one of the guiding stars. And
very aspirational goal, yeah. I mean, the overhead for Shor's algorithm has been brought down enormously to avoid 1 million qubits for something that people might care vaguely about the answer. But that is still a very tough ask to build. And it should be stressed that you can always use bigger classical codes and make that number significantly bigger. So we still have a big gap to leap across from the scale we're at today to the scale we need to be, from the dollar cost per qubit today to the dollar cost per qubit, which would make it even make sense to build such a big machine. You don't want to be spending $100 billion to build a quantum computer. It's too much. It's not worth that much. We have to reduce the cost per qubit by orders of magnitude so that it makes economic sense to build the computer as well.
And so I see that now the main trend is kind of going towards making at least 1 qubit perfectly like fault-tolerant. Because before there was, let's say, NISQ era, we had several qubits, but most like physical ones. But then they're very like fragile or lose their coherence, accumulate a lot of errors. So what are what are the existing like strategies or solutions? How do we build like a fault-tolerant qubit, for example?
Again, it is very architecture dependent. The focus in my case has always been on chip-based quantum computing, where you typically, not always, but typically only have nearest neighbor interactions. When you are that way restricted, at the moment, there's the surface code, which is a square grid-based approach, the color code, which has more triangular symmetry. There are other codes as well, but at the moment, most of the research is done on the surface code for that specific case, where you have a square grid of qubits, four-way connectivity. Not to say other ways can't do better, but at the moment, that is the most straightforward, most well understood approach that we are still working out how to calculate the true overhead of, and therefore know what it even means for a code to do better.
And which one is your favorite approaches out of?
I've been focused on the surface code for a long time. So my goal right now is to build a compiler that can take an arbitrary algorithm, compile it using state-of-the-art techniques down to the surface code to give us the tools we need to ask the question, what is better, right? If you don't know how well one code can work, you can't tell whether you are making progress when you study a different code. So, really need to provide that baseline. Compilation of quantum algorithms to fault-tolerant structures is currently done very, very far from optimally and does not take into account all of the details. So we want to improve the optimality, get closer to something that's optimal, and include all the details so we haven't kidded ourselves we've done well when in fact what we're doing doesn't work.
Right. And maybe you can speak to why surface code, 2D surface code is in some sense special, or what draw you to it, or because there are many codes. I think we read about, when we first learn about error correction, most likely it's something else, repetition code, maybe some other code. What makes 2D surface code special?
Sure. So firstly, repetition code is not a quantum code. So you're only going to store classical information using a repetition code. If you want a quantum code, often the first codes you study are things like the Steen code, concatenated codes. And while these are simple codes to study, they don't have great thresholds. They definitely do not have good overheads as you concatenate and go to larger and larger protection levels. The surface code, by contrast, has a much higher threshold and much better hardware compatibility because you only need a 2D array with nearest neighbor interaction. So much easier to build physically, and that really manifests in recent results where the surface code has been shown to work. You can build hardware with low enough error rates and the right connectivity to get it working. It will be a while before anyone implements a concatenated Steen code. The threshold is much more challenging. The movement or long-range interactions are much more challenging, and the overhead is highly significant. So, those are not, the very, very early codes are not likely to ever be practical. More advanced codes that are investigated today, when you do have long interactions, are block codes, where you have many logical qubits encoded in a larger, but not that much larger number of physical qubits. You do need a different set of hardware to what we were using at Google, but a lot of promise there to bring down the qubit count for practical applications.
You said that from PhD you were involved in quantum error correction.
Yeah.
Maybe what brought you there? Brought to this topic, and what was your even PhD about?
Sure. So I didn't come to quantum computing in one step. When I graduated from high school, I had a diverse range of interests: computer science, computer engineering, mathematics, physics, and I did a full program in all of those subjects. So my first plan when I hit university was I will focus on classical compute, maybe work for Intel one day. That was where I figured I would head. But as time went by and I learned more and more computer engineering, it didn't feel like it had quite the interest that I had thought it would. You would be part of a team of thousands. You would be given a very small part of the chip. You need to work in part of a large group. And it wasn't clear that that was what I wanted to, in my mind, settle for.
So what did you envision at that time? To build compilers for this x86?
No, I was imagining that maybe you would take some small part of the logic unit that is the chip and optimize it. But the more I learned about that, the less that I wanted to do that. So the first thing that I thought beyond being a computer engineer was, how about we do something really cool like string theory? All right. So I did a year in string theory in the mathematics department because that's where that research was done. And that year taught me that the most likely outcome of your life, if you devote it to string theory, is nothing, because in all probability, you will have chosen the wrong theory to champion. There are many different string theories. And statistically, you are likely to spend 30 to 40 years of your life doing research in something that is wrong. And so after doing that year, I decided, no, that's not what I had to do. So I took a year off and I came back and did physics. And I thought, all right, fine, early universe cosmology. And a year later, I realized I had made exactly the same mistake, that there are many different early universe cosmology theories, most likely outcome an entire lifetime spent on something that is proved wrong. And then for whatever reason, the Australian government decided, you know what, we're a little country, even today it's 25 million people, we can't be good at everything, but let's be good at quantum computing. Why not? Got to pick something, let's pick that. And I sat there and thought, hang on, quantum computing, computer engineering, computer science, mathematics, physics, right, sold, done. PhD in quantum computing. And it was a perfect fit for me. But yeah, it didn't happen overnight. I tried a number of different things that I later decided were not a good use of my time, cancelled, pivoted, tried again, pivoted again, until such time as I found something I thought I could really be very interested in for a very, very long time. PhD in quantum computing started with modelling the chosen physical system at the time in Australia, the phosphorescent silicon cane architecture. Spent 18 months working on that. Decided that was not what I wanted to spend all of my time on. People do incredible work in Australia, but that is a really, really tough system to build. And I felt that I didn't want to be, again, devoting all my time to modeling and supporting a specific architecture where, again, there's a very likely output. We're not going to have 50 different successful quantum computers. There's going to be a small number. So if you are overly invested in one, there's a good chance that you spend your time researching something that ultimately doesn't work. So for me, the solution to that problem, the possibility of doing research that is never used, was solved by moving to error correction and algorithms, which are required for quantum computing. You don't have these things, you have no quantum computer. So I went through the usual path back then. I mean, this was, early 2000s, learning about the Steam code, seeing what fault-tolerant algorithms look like in that, studying how to decompose single qubit rotations in fault-tolerant gauges, and little by little, built my thesis around algorithms and error correction. It was only after I finished my PhD and went to Canada that I met Robert Rausendorf, and we spent a good 6 months talking about topological quantum error correction. And from that moment on, it was like, great, these things are far more compatible with hardware, to the nearest neighbor, far more compatible with achievable error rates of order 1%. Beat that and you can build something. Let's really study those and see if we can make those well understood and well used. Because in the beginning, they weren't well understood. It wasn't even obvious if the theory worked. And so there was quite a lot of theoretical work that needed to be done to establish that field as a viable way to do computation. And then I haven't looked back since. This has been my main focus.
Did you consider maybe to go straight, talk to Kitaev or Sergey Bravin?
So I have definitely spoken to Kitaev, not many times. Yeah. He's, of course, a standout, brilliant individual. However, his interests don't necessarily lie in working out the nitty-gritties of quantum circuits to get a quantum computing running. I think, to be frank, he would consider that a little bit beneath his talents, and he's happy to leave that to other people. I mean, yeah, he's a wonderful guy, but I don't think he had any interest in the practical realization of the codes that he's responsible for inventing.
And then, so how did you end up in Google?
So it happened by a series of accidents. I was working in Melbourne. I had funding from IARPA, so from the US, and there were a couple of hundred people in that project, and it was supposed to run for 4 years, but after 2 years, for whatever reason, budget cuts, they decided they had the answers they wanted already, they cut the program. So they dumped a couple of hundred people on the quantum computing market. And I was very fortunate. I give great thanks to John Martinez. Within 6 hours, I had another job at the University of California, Santa Barbara. So he made an offer, said, that sounds great, thank you so very much. And then we worked on the work permit, came over and joined the University of California, Santa Barbara.
So at that time, it was just John Martinez group,
That's
UCB,
right.
before
So it's a team of
Google
about
came.
30 people, postdocs, PhD students, grad students, and that's the team I joined as a staff researcher. So we're on one floor of the physics building, and it was a great time, right? Everyone was deeply involved in all aspects of the quantum computer, from the coding to opening and closing the fridges to wiring them up. They had me doing the soldering of amplifiers under a microscope. It was a wonderful time. Very, very hands-on, lots of fun. During that time period, Google was experimenting with the D-Wave machine. So they were renting time on the D-Wave machine and becoming increasingly convinced that they didn't know how to turn that machine into useful computation. And they thought perhaps the solution to that would be to acquire a superconducting qubit hardware team and get them to build the version of D-Wave that would work better. Now, full credit to D-Wave, what D-Wave builds is very hard to build. They have some very clever engineers, they have a lot of IP, they do know what they're doing. If your goal is to build an annealer, go talk to D-Wave, they know how to do that. It is not trivial at any level to replicate the machine they have built. Nevertheless, when we looked at doing this, some effort was investigated, and the ultimate conclusion was it would be extremely difficult to build something significantly different and better in the annealer space. Right? And so then the pivot was to the surface code.
It looks like Google was not fully upset with D-Wave. Still continuing the search for quantum computers.
Yeah. So, D-Wave is a remarkable organization. They have been around for an awfully long time, as long as Google has even been a company. So you have to give credit to their persistence and their ability to keep that dream alive, keep the funding flowing, keep the engineers engaged. Not many people can do what D-Wave has done. Build 5,000 qubits, devices, take your pick in terms of your language, make a working system, get numbers out, sell product. It's remarkable, right? Not many groups can claim that.
Yeah. From quantum annealers to surface code, that seems like a rather big jump, but
Yeah, I had been working on surface codes for a long time before joining John's group and before joining Google. Certainly that seemed to me the logical thing to do if you have a superconducting system with only local interactions. Try to build a surface code quantum computer. That has been the focus in the Google group. If the Google group has one feature that I think is remarkable, it's the willingness to change architecture. If you look at John Martinez's work, it went from phase qubits. Those were researched for some years. It was decided that was not going to work, went to transmons. Fixed frequency coupling, decided that was not going to work, tunable coupling. Tunable coupling, different types of tunable coupling. And they're very willing to go back to the fundamental architecture, the substrate, all sorts of different things. And say, you know what? We think that's a dead end. Let's change it substantially and try this new approach. So that was certainly true when the pivot was made from annealers to the surface code. It was felt the annealers were not going to work out. And so you pivot to your next best idea of something that has a chance of working out. And if there is one lesson to learn that for the field in general, is I think that's incredibly healthy and should be made easier for more groups to do. I think too many groups get stuck in a particular approach. They feel that that's why they're funded, and they don't feel that they have the freedom to say, you know what, we have 5-10 years of expertise in this system, and our conclusion is it's not competitive with these systems. We should just take all of our expertise, clever people, and set up a new lab. That will be a better use of money. No one says that, but I think that should be something that is encouraged.
It's very important for research groups to steer, not get stuck in one direction. And if something doesn't work, just find the solution which works. Be more goal oriented instead of having a hammer and trying to find the nail.
Yeah. So problem. I'd say I think the Google group provides a good model of that, where for many years they focused on annealers and then they pivoted to surface code and then many different iterations of that. And even now with the increasing success of neutral atoms, they're becoming interested in that because these are very different. They are getting more qubits together more quickly. There seems to be a lot of potential there for rapid progress, and so why not have a finger in that pie too? It's totally different to superconductors, but it doesn't mean that you can't have a stake in that approach as well.
Can you imagine that, I don't know, for some reason, surface codes don't work, or like the fault-tolerant stuff? Like, what would be the other directions to look into?
I think neutral atoms have a lot going for them. The number one issue in my mind with the surface code is not that it will or won't work. It's that it'll be too expensive.
Mm-hmm.
So, right now building all of the things you need to keep a cryogenic fridge cold, all of the electronics, all of the wiring, the chip, its shell, its case, these things cost a lot of money. And it's not immediately obvious that you can make it 100 times cheaper, right? There's no very obvious pathway where you do that. So I think that is the real challenge with superconducting qubits. Not will it or won't it ever work, but will it work at a price that makes sense to pay? By contrast, it seems that there is more hope that something based on nature-based qubits, atoms, ions, photons, something nature-based, has a chance to be cheaper per qubit and may have a better chance to achieve extreme scale and run something practical. Yeah, so I would argue that the biggest risk to the surface code effort is whether our engineers are smart enough to come up with ways to realize it cheap enough, which at the moment is a very open question. Every individual superconducting line in a quantum computer at the moment is expensive, right? If you think about the fridges, the scale of the fridges they require, some of these cost millions of dollars. And if you have just a few hundred qubits in it, the amortized cost of your qubit is very high. And it doesn't obviously scale to 1 million qubits if it was still that cost per qubit. You would end up with something that, is just difficult to justify.
So, but let's say if you are given unlimited resources, human power, like what kind of project would you do?
I mean, if I had unlimited resources, I wouldn't use all of those unlimited resources to build a quantum computer. Let's put it that way, right? I think it would be very irresponsible at the human level to do. Research should be done at a reasonable cost. There is a point where you are taking away resources from other more worthy projects, so it should be done at a reasonable cost. The number one reason that I'm not working at Google anymore is because I put my foot down and said, no, we're going to do this research open source, and I'm not going to negotiate on that, right? And they were like, well, that's fine, but you can't do the open source research here. In my mind, humanity clearly wins, the field clearly wins when we work together. And we need to do more of that, not less of that. Right now, there are many different superconducting qubit groups, all doing research with a lot of secrecy. That's a lot of duplicate spending, right? A lot of duplicate talent solving the same problem. And that's very unfortunate. It would be much better if the field was run more like CERN, more like IDA, more like the International Space Station was run, as a global international collaboration of academics that all most definitely share everything. We would get a quantum computer objectively and obviously a lot quicker if we did that, right? There's no question about that. It would require fewer people, fewer dollars, the result would be faster. I'm not saying we have to choose one particular technology, but in any given technology right now, there are many neutral atom groups, there are many ion trap groups, there are many superconducting groups, many quantum dot groups, many. We've got hundreds and hundreds of groups around the world all trying to do very overlapping research. And it is extremely difficult to see how all of that money spent on all of that duplicate research could ever possibly be paid back.
Yeah, and also the irony is that in a different scale, like these talents are also very scarce.
That's right.
Yeah, what do you think are the big forces that is sort of preventing this kind of open source approach, like this ideal situation from unfolding?
Yeah, to be frank, I think it is the way physicists went about raising the capital to do their work they wanted to do. So it was hyped up the cryptography aspect. It's hyped up the computational revolutionary aspect. So the promise of vast riches through quantum computing has become an accepted part of popular culture. And so companies are now able to and are raising hundreds of millions of dollars and sometimes more to build that quantum computer and reap those riches that have been promised. So if there was one central mistake, it would be that. Because the reality is, Shor's algorithm was invented in 1994. It is 2025. That is 31 years later. 31 years later, typical state of the art for a quantum computer is around 100 qubits. We need 1 million. Maybe 10,000 if you're very lucky and have arbitrary range interactions. And as yet, over 3 decades later, there is not a single known quantum algorithm where you can say this specific classical algorithm, which is run routinely and costs this much to run, would be cheaper to run on a quantum computer. Not one. And yet, everyone is convinced they're going to make so very much money building a quantum computer.
Quantum rush.
It would be much more reasonable to say that quantum computing objectively can do certain things exponentially faster than a classical computer. Isn't that fascinating? This will have an impact on computer science. This will have an impact on mathematics. It could have an impact on certain areas of physics research. We should build one of these as an international collaboration to bring people together. And in 2025, we definitely need reasons to bring ourselves together because of all the wonderful fundamental things we'll learn. Right? And unfortunately, that is not the path we took when it came to where do we get the money for quantum computing.
Right. Maybe government should step up in this regard to really foster something.
It would be extremely reasonable, in my mind, for the governments of the world to look at how much money they have put into the quantum ecosystem and say, you know what? How about we pool our resources? Yeah. How about we make it a national project? Let's choose, the half a dozen most popular ways of building a quantum computer. Choose all of them and get the very best from everywhere to have the very best shot at doing these things and publish everything. Because in my strong opinion, at the moment, the world is spending way, way, way more on quantum computing than it should be.
Right, and they're duplicative in many cases.
Duplicative. It's a talent drain, it's a resource drain, and it has got to the point where we should acknowledge that and strongly think about better ways of doing it. And the TQEC project, as a totally open source, volunteer-based project, is an example. There is no reason that this couldn't be a model for academic research in hardware as well. Even in academia, there is a certain push to patent, keep secret, protect your IP, not talk about the details for fear of competition with other academic labs for funding, right? It's a real competition. And that needs to be solved at the funding level so people don't feel the necessity to do that.
But does that also happen for other fields? My main concern, I'm also involved in some open source projects. And then what happens is okay, I'm providing open source project for the people. And then they would, based on whatever the software developed, they can build a closed software on top of that. And then, for example, whoever developed the open source doesn't really have access to the closed ones. You don't know, it's just a black box. It works, for example, 10 times better than what you built, but
it depends on the scale and the professionalism of the open source group.
Yeah.
The TQEC group, in terms of interested members, is over 1,000 people. In terms of actual hands-on coders, we're about 24 people. So it's not a small effort. And there's no reason that can't grow to the point where, I'm sorry, but you're not going to be able to compete with it, right? So, you have to produce a quality tool. And history has done that. Everything from the Linux operating system to GCC.
Yeah.
There are multi-decade, very mature open source projects where people don't compete with them. These are industry standard.
Yeah, I agree. Linux is probably one of the great examples of the open source community.
So you have to take the open source seriously. And right now, the TQEC project is at the stage of doing research on the low-level circuits to realize the fault-tolerant gates. Then once all of those have been worked out, and that's still a process that's ongoing, we will come back and re-engineer the code base to run faster, streaming, and make it really useful to people everywhere. But yeah, right now it's absolutely collective research, and I don't know any way that this research could have been done differently to the way it's currently done. It's best done as an open source project. There's been good ideas, even just in the last week, within the TQEC group, that are genuine community contributions that make the TQEC tool state of the art. So you have to take the software seriously. You certainly don't want it to be the case that one or two people paid behind closed doors can suddenly turn your software into something that's 10 times better. I don't believe that's the case for TQEC.
So from a community perspective, how do you feel that TQEC or similar projects has lowered the entry barrier for people outside quantum to get into things like error correction?
Absolutely. I mean, that's a big push of the community, is to provide pathways in. So we have a feed-in ecosystem. So there is a Coursera course which Google sponsored and made free to everyone, which was great, which introduces people to the ideas of quantum error correction in the surface code, up to and including using STEM, which is again open source from Google. And then the TQEC community itself runs weekly meetings to educate people beyond that point to do computation. And we have a guiding philosophy that within reason, it should be possible to take almost anyone with any background and give them some project straight away that they can get started on. Many, many problems within quantum compiling can be expressed as pure classical in, classical out algorithms. Do some research on this algorithm, work out a good, fast way to do that. It's not like you have to go back and do a PhD in quantum computing to be able to devise those algorithms. You don't. Come to us with programming interest and skill, and you'll be able to do things. And this shows in the people that we have. We have a lawyer who works on Spanish bankruptcy law and has written a substantial body of code for the conversion of SketchUp files into the input for TQEC and back again. We have a political economist that has worked almost solo on the body of code that takes a ZX graph and maps it to a three-dimensional lattice structure. So we are very serious when we say anyone from anywhere, whatever your country is, whatever your profession is, we will take you and we will give you a program, give you a way in that doesn't require lots and lots of learning, right? If humanity is good at anything, it's good at taking desperately complicated things, dividing up the work against many people, and letting each one specialize and just solve a little atomic problem and then assembling all the pieces. So that's really the focus of TQEC. If all you can do is use a tool, that's fine. Use the tool, help with the documentation. That's still enormously beneficial to the community. If you can program, then we'll give you a task. If you can really program very well, we'll give you a hard task, right? If you know quantum computing very well, then we'll put you on one of the low-level circuit research problems where you're going to need those quantum learnings and everything in between. Someone comes to us and knows a ton about continuous integration. They can help maintain that aspect of it and be involved. Devising good tests, just coming up with tests. I used this tool and did this and broke it, right? People just want to break the tool. Very valuable. Don't need to know anything about anything. Just come and use the tool as the document says, find where it doesn't work, create an issue, let someone else that knows more do it. Help them reproduce the issue. You're being very helpful. And this does not require a PhD or a degree in software engineering. It just requires an interest in quantum computing and say, hey, I read the documentation, this didn't make sense. I read the documentation, it did make sense, I did what it said, it didn't work, right? So, everyone of every level can be genuinely valuable to the TQEC project.
I see. And then this is a community using over 1,000 people.
There are over 1,000 people in the community, yeah. Not all of which, by any stretch of the imagination, do the hands-on coding, but as mentioned, there are many useful things to do that don't force you to be someone capable of doing the hands-on coding.
And how do you, or TQEC in general, manage this complexity of figuring out who to get which task? And it seems like you have to tailor a lot of things for individual people.
The number of active coders, as mentioned, is around a couple of dozen. So it is not, from a management point of view, that difficult to talk to anyone that's interested in coding and help get them started. When it comes to the actual organization, it's a GitHub repository. So we create issues, we have pull requests, we have code review, the usual things, right? And any GitHub repository is designed to be able to have teams of hundreds, thousands. I mean, it scales. So people create issues, work on issues. Anyone goes and can read through the issues and then get in touch with the person that created the issue and learn and have their hands held as they address it. So, yeah, certainly I don't see any issue moving forward in terms of managing the project. If we had 10 times as many people, I think we'd be able to put them to work just fine.
Yeah. I feel like quantum computing, like every aspect of quantum computing has blown up to such enormous fields. And I wonder what advice you would have for people wanting to, for instance, get into quantum error correction. So I know people who are in the quantum community. They are quantum computing researchers. They just haven't spent as much time as they'd like in quantum error correction. There are also PhD students who are just coming up to speed, and then they're deciding where to go in their research. And then there's maybe where you were in high school and college students who's just generally curious.
Kindergarten.
So yeah, for people at each stage of their career, I mean, if they're interested in, say, learning about quantum error correction, right?
For sure.
Well, yeah.
With the one caveat that at the moment the TQEC community focuses on 2D array of qubits, nearest neighbor interactions. With that one caveat, all of those people are welcome, right? Including kindergartens. I'll take that, right? Because you never know where the conversation will go, and it is absolutely beneficial to everyone to try to find fun ways to engage everyone, right? I can certainly see, no matter what level of expertise someone comes to me with, opportunities to learn the rules of manipulating the blocks that we use in SketchUp. It's really just assembling blocks that are very lightweight in terms of assumed expertise. You just have to make sure the colors match when you snap them together, right? So I would absolutely take on the challenge of a kindergartner. I mean, why not? And who knows where that kindergarten leads to? Maybe their parents, maybe they have other people, maybe they come in. Getting many people to work together starts with not turning anyone away, right? And that person you choose to talk to and not turn away often leads to the next person who comes in and says, it's really cool what you did with that guy. I'm going to help you out, right? So, everyone that you listed is welcome. Everyone that you listed can be productive in this field. So, our job at the TQEC community is make sure that anyone from anywhere, no matter your profession, no matter your country, no matter your language, we can find you something that you'll really enjoy to do in the field of quantum computing. At the moment, specifically in the field of surface code quantum computing, but this is our starting point. Only when we complete the compiler that can do that well, as a community, we will start looking at other codes, other architectures systematically. To take a little bit of a look in the future, right now we look at monolithic 2D. The next step after that is non-monolithic 2D, where you have weak links between multiple patches of computer. This requires an upgrade to the compiler. It is not trivial to do. We'll do that next. And so on. Then you can have medium-range interactions on your chips. You can start thinking about moving qubits around, long-range interactions. All of these things concretely add additional complexity and more opportunities to reduce the overhead, but it should be the case that they're done in logical sequence so that you can see how each additional power improves or doesn't improve. Breaking up a monolithic computer into separate pieces will not always improve things. In many cases, it will make things much, much worse. So what the cost is. Does it help? Does it hurt?
I think it would be good to give some explanation of your favorite surface codes.
Sure.
Maybe some basics of the main ideas which lay the foundation of it.
So the main idea for any error correction code is this idea that you can reduce all of the errors in your quantum computer to just two types of errors, bit flips and phase flips. You can then also build quantum circuits that check for these two types of errors. The key thing that makes the surface code work very well is that the circuits to check for bit flips and phase flips are very small circuits. You only need of order a half a dozen gates a very small local circuit to generate a bit of information that tells you, do I have errors nearby? So that in turn directly leads to the fact that your gates don't have to work that well to get the error correction working well. And if your gates work reasonably well, it doesn't require an enormous overhead of qubits to achieve very low logical error rates. So the key thing there is very small circuits to extract information about bit flips and phase flips. Fundamentally, if you think of the surface code a bit like a chessboard, it's black and white squares, you can imagine that, for example, all of the black squares detect phase flip errors. All of the white squares detect bit flip errors. And each square consists of 4 qubits on the corners of the square where you store data, and a single qubit in the center which does all of the checking of its 4 nearest neighbors. So these are the small local circuits that power the surface code and give it such a high tolerance to error.
So speaking of the type of the errors, you mentioned the bit flip error or the phase errors.
Okay.
Are there, especially when you work with physical systems like superconducting qubits, did you see any other types of errors kicking in beyond that theory?
Yeah, so to build a quantum computer that works using the theoretical model of errors requires a lot of effort. For example, at Google, they don't really work with qubits. They work with multi-level systems. So you can think of it as a tunable frequency oscillator. That's what we use to store our data. We use the ground and first excited state to store the data. But there are higher excited states. And if the qubit, which is really a multi-level system, leaks into those higher states, then when it interacts with other qubits, it messes everything up. So this is leakage. And you have to work hard at the physical level to remove leakage. When you have radioactive particles in the material that makes up your quantum computer, those particles can hit your chip and cause errors. So sometimes, worst case, if the chip's not well engineered, it can heat up the whole chip and cause everything to have an unacceptably high error rate. These days, a lot of work has gone into reducing that outcome, but even so, there are still cases where lines of qubits do get messed up, which is a significant problem for error correction. It will continue to be the case that a lot of work needs to be done at the hardware level to remove errors that are not easy to correct using software at the error correction level. So yeah, that is an ongoing task to build a quantum computer that is good enough to only need quantum error correction.
But so far, it seems like we're good with just fixing, if we can fix those.
Well, when you say so far, so good. In the recent demonstration of a distance 3, distance 5, distance 7 surface code, so the 3 smaller sizes of surface code, there was also a study of the repetition code, so just a long snaking line of qubits. Mm-hmm. And the logical error rate of that long snaking line did bottom out at a floor where it stopped going down as you added more qubits, due to some of these events that I mentioned that made larger scale issues with the hardware. So we know already that it will take more work to remove errors at the physical level that are not natively handled by error correction, not done yet. And I suspect that will be true of many different architectures. It's not trivial to get to the point where your computer only exhibits bit flips and phase flips. Yeah.
And you probably need a lot of classical infrastructure for enabling this kind of very fast reaction in error correction.
Yeah, we do. I would argue the reaction time at the moment is not a big problem because the computers are so small that we're not trying to run quantum computations in a reaction-limited manner. We're totally qubit limited. So it is certainly reasonable and possible to trade speed for using fewer qubits. So you slow down the computation, you use fewer qubits, and then the reaction time doesn't need to be so great. To be very, very specific, when you do non-trivial quantum computation, there's always a process of feed forward. You have to do some measurements, do some classical processing, change something that comes next. This is inherent to quantum computing. any quantum computation that doesn't have that feed-forward step-by-step process is not a difficult quantum computation to simulate. It's not doing anything universal. So given you have that restriction, you might say, well, classical computing looks like it will then limit the speed of quantum computing. And while that's true on paper, it's only going to be true in practice when we have very large quantum computers where we can afford to shorten the time of the execution by allocating more qubits to the computation. At some point, you can't just allocate more qubits and make things run faster. You need to actually run the classical feed-forward system faster. But we are far, far away from reaching that point where the classical processing is the thing that slows down our quantum computation.
So for the surface codes, did they originally appear for quantum systems, or they have some prior background, like coming back from more like a classical error correction approaches?
Yeah, certainly my first exposure to the surface code was tailored to qubits. So the early work by Kitaev, Ravi, these were my earliest exposures to that system. It was at that time a toric system, so they would take a square and match both the left, right, and the top, bottom boundaries. Initially, it was only for quantum memory, and then as time went by, people like Robert Rausendorf, Kovac Goyal, Hans Briegel, they came along and they expanded the capabilities of the toric code to be something that could do computation as well. There was very specifically a lot of work that needed to be done to make it compatible with 2D nearest neighbor computation. Protocols earlier to that, so you had Andrew Dennis et al., classic 2000 paper. Those papers assumed when it came to computation that you had transversal interactions. So not truly local in 2D, it was local in 3D. The local in 2D work came later. That was the step-by-step progression. So yeah, for me, surface code started off as a toric code, which was for a quantum computer.
And the toric code, I understand, like the main idea is just to close the boundary, so you will
That's right.
always have transitions
Yeah.
infinite.
I mean, they did later planarize it, but even then it wasn't immediately a computational code. It was just a memory code. That work to make it into computation came later. Robert Rausendorf, I would argue, spearheaded the work to make it a practical computational path.
Was already like the concepts of ancilla qubits or stabilizers. Just trying to understand that what was the path of the development of these ideas?
Yeah, so definitely ancilla qubits were in there from very early on. Certainly by the time Robert Rausendorf came along, which was prior to 2006, all through that period, there were ancilla qubits in there. So it was very explicit quantum circuits that were measuring the stabilizers. Even back in 2000, Andrew Dennis and others, those papers contained quantum circuits to actually measure the stabilizers. So the practicality has always been a big part of the surface code, not just we will measure this multi-body stabilizer from the beginning, though I would say a lot of the literature post the very, very beginning did stray into the regime of let's forget about the circuit and just study it as an object that can just magically measure stabilizers. My passion is more for the work that focuses on circuits and practicality and implementation and what is the real overhead. If you don't include those details, then it's not obvious what you were really, really saying about physics and quantum computing and computation.
So now let's say we have the surface code implementing quantum memory. We can protect quantum states. Where do we go from there to realize fault-tolerant quantum computation?
Yeah, so there have been a series of evolutions. In the very early days, it was all about puncturing the surface code, cutting holes in it, and then braiding those holes around each other. That is not done very much anymore. The focus has moved to what's called lattice surgery, where you have patches and those patches interact. So done right, you turn a quantum computation into a complex three-dimensional branching structure that happens to map your data in the right way. But the actual objects can look quite arcane, no longer really able to identify, where is my C0 gate? Where are the different gates that used to be in the quantum circuit? You end up strictly with a three-dimensional structure that just does all of the work in one go. And that is, in my mind, where the future lies for the field, finding more and more efficient ways to convert quantum circuits into three-dimensional structures that are very tight and compact and do the work of the circuit without actually looking gate by gate at anything like the original circuit.
What is required to build like fully fault-tolerant qubits?
So
the minimal requirements.
Minimal requirements you can get away with as little as 17 qubits. So the smallest surface code, distance 3, you have a 3x3 grid of data qubits. It's 9 data qubits, and then you have 8 measure qubits to check those 9. So 17 is the smallest you can do.
Mm-hmm.
And then it just grows quadratically as you allow the code the power to correct more and more errors. So yeah, those earliest demonstrations, those smallest demonstrations have been made. The question becomes, when is it better to use a code of that form to do logical gates? The answer is not yet. So by a certain metric, if you use enough qubits, it's already possible to do better than bare qubit memory using the surface code, but it is not yet possible to do a logic gate and do better than a physical gate. So we're going to need physical error rates that are lower so that we achieve significantly lower logical error rates, that it's actually worth using error correction. It's not worth it yet.
Yeah, I guess then like the next question is like, having this fault-tolerant qubit, what can we do with it? Or like, I'll say, how do we scale up? So because we would like to have fault-tolerant quantum computing,
that's right,
interaction between those qubits.
I mean, if it's just 1 or 2 or 3 logical qubits, you're not going to do anything useful, obviously, because I can simulate 1 or 2 or 3 qubits precisely on a regular classical computer very, very cheaply.
So how about going to 100?
So you would need more of order of 100. And even 100, it is yet to be shown what you would do with only 100 logical qubits that would outperform a classical computer. So much more likely in my mind at the several hundred to 1,000 logical qubits is where you have enough power to have a chance. Quantum computers are very powerful. People are very clever when it comes to programming algorithms to do quantum mechanical things. So you need quite a big quantum computer before you have a chance to outperform a classical computer. And the search remains for computations that can be done as soon as possible that will create data that you couldn't get by other means, whether classically computationally or simply going to the lab and mixing things or building things. You always need to remember that the fair comparison of a quantum computer is not with any specific algorithm run on a classical computer. It's with anything done anyway, anyhow, right? And if the cheapest, best, fastest way of studying a system is just going and building it, then you have to compare with that. Is it cheaper to run a computation on a quantum computer, or is it cheaper to just go and build, mix, study the system physically, right? Ultimately, from a business point of view, if you can spend $1,000 on an experiment and get the answer, you're not going to spend $1 million on a quantum computer to get the answer, right? So I would argue our field is very much still looking for something where you could save someone money or deepen someone's understanding of a quantum system using a quantum computer. But there are promising indications. There's a paper from Google just recently on looking at the structure of molecules. But again, it should be stressed that those molecules can have their structure studied using NMR, which is certainly cheaper than running a quantum computer.
NMR could be also analog quantum computer.
Maybe, but very specifically, there are well-known experiments to determine the structure of these molecules that don't require classical or quantum computation and are the standard way it's currently done.
Just like to understand, so for surface codes, do I correctly understand that it's mostly about figuring out what errors happened to a logical qubit, to like the physical qubits which comprise the logical qubit?
Yeah, so any error correction code is about determining when and where errors happen to physical qubits. You don't necessarily need to think in terms of, is it part of a logical qubit? But the main thing you want to make sure is that collections of physical qubit errors don't corrupt your logical data. Right? In a block code, you won't necessarily be able to point at a qubit and say you are part of this logical qubit. It might technically be part of many logical qubits. The main focus is, can I identify the errors well enough such that logical data is not corrupted? Even in the surface code, when you run a computation, the structure is more complicated than allows you to easily say this part of the computation is this logical qubit. It's a structure that supports computation. It consists of many physical qubits. You want to make sure errors are identified and corrected so that the data running through that computation is not corrupted. But yes, as with all error correction codes, the goal is to identify physical errors and fix them in software so that you get the right answer from your computation.
Do we fix them, or we just keep track of that the error happened?
Track them. Yeah. There's in very few, not zero, in very few quantum systems does it make sense to fix them. Some systems it does make sense. A specific example of that is if you have a quantum system that has a bias, for example, measuring a 0 is frequently much more reliable than measuring a 1. And that means that there are physical systems, and it's been published, where it makes sense to go back and fix the data so that the probable measurement outcome is a 0 rather than a 1, because you get more reliable data that way, sometimes very much more reliable data that way. In a truly symmetric computer where there's no bias between, for example, measuring a 0, 1 and everything is symmetric, then no, you would do it all in software. But it should never be forgotten that the details matter, and there are certainly systems where it actually does make sense to go in and physically fix the errors.
So on the topic of software, how would you describe the importance of design automation and using all kinds of softwares to help us understand the behavior before we go implement it in a lab?
Yeah, I would say it goes beyond even just understanding the behavior. Fundamentally, driving a quantum computer requires a lot of software. That doesn't exist. So in parallel to the race to build a quantum computer from a physical point of view, there has to be a parallel effort that builds the software to drive that. The community that I work with, TQEC, we are focused on one particular architecture at the moment, 2D nearest neighbor, but it's an enabling technology. If someone gifted the planet right now a 1 million qubit fault-tolerant quantum computer, the fact remains we do not have the software to run that device. We probably won't have that software for quite some time. So, it would be a challenging scramble to cobble together something that could even make that device work. Our goal is to make sure quality compilation technology is ready as those computers become available. So, it's not an option. It's not just for analysis, it's a true need. We need a quantum operating system. In addition to that, when it comes to working out what is the best thing to do next, you need a compiler so you can say, okay, this works this well, let's see how that thing works. And that goes all the way down to different physical architectures. To truly know whether one physical architecture is better than another, you need a very well-constructed compiler for both, and then compile, say, the same algorithm down to both architectures, and fundamentally ask yourself, how many dollars does it take to build the necessary computer, and how long would it take to run? So without doing those things, you really, really can't know which way forward is better. So compilers, I would see, are a critical piece of the quantum computing ecosystem to enable quantum computing at all and give clarity to the research that is done in quantum error correction and algorithms and architectures as to which way actually works better and what paths may be taken to make systems do better still.
Right. And I think it's useful to zoom in more on the ideas of compilers and operating systems. There are companies and groups in the quantum community, for instance, that propose different ideas of compilers and operating systems. But I think what you're referring to is a specific kind of complexity that arises from running a fault-tolerant quantum computer. So it's not just compiling to a logical circuit that somehow runs an instance of an algorithm. It's actually to start from the logical circuit and how to make it physically happen on a real device.
That's correct.
To me, at least, I first heard about like error corrections from quantum computers. But errors also exist in classical systems. So what are the maybe like classical traditional ways to fix the errors? And is it already a solved problem for like traditional computers, traditional communication systems?
Sure.
Maybe if we can go into that direction.
First things first, in classical systems, the error rates are very, very, very much lower than in quantum systems. So for most classical systems, error correction is very lightweight if it exists at all, maybe a parity bit or two, if anything. A full error correction code is very rarely needed in computation. In communication, sure, there are protocols that help you communicate digitally over noisy channels, and there you will use error correction. But certainly in computation, which is my focus, there's little to no error correction during a computation. If you have a floating point unit on a computer, it's not also got a layer of error correction on top of everything. You rely on the fact that transistors are very, very reliable, registers are very, very reliable, and you can build a computer that will almost always do the right thing. It's just not true in the quantum space. In the quantum space, to get to a quantum logic gate that only fails one time in 1,000 is extremely challenging. It was only recently announced that in an ion trap they had reached one part in 10,000, 10 to the minus 4 error rate for a 2-qubit gate just recently, just the last couple of weeks. So these are extremely difficult numbers to reach, and even that state-of-the-art performance is unlikely to be enough to do useful quantum computation without error correction. There are plenty of people trying to make it so, but in my opinion, it's unlikely. So when you have a huge difference between error rates, 10 to the minus 3 to 10 to the minus 4, really pushing it state-of-the-art, versus maybe 10 to the minus 18 or significantly lower for transistors, you have a very different ecosystem and very different need for error correction.
So what are the limits for, let's say, for superconducting systems for physical qubit, like for this LC, nonlinear LC circuit?
Yeah.
Resonator. Where are the errors mostly coming from, and what's like the minimum error it's predicted to achieve?
Sure. So a lot comes down to the coherence time of your qubits. How long does your data live when you put it on a single qubit? So there are many things that come into that. The fact that the substrate is not loss-free, so there is dissipation in the system. It may be technically a superconducting system, but it's not a dissipation-less system. The electric field associated with your qubit state is not just confined to the superconducting part of the system. It also interacts with the substrate, the gap, other parts of the system, and there is dissipation. So that's one. You also have significant crosstalk, which spoils your detailed knowledge of the system. In some of these systems, the crosstalk can be very strong, which then limits the fidelity of your gates. And then if you have yet another layer of issues, so decoherence, crosstalk, the fact that not all the parts of the chip work. To get to 100% yield is extremely challenging. It's quite common to have individual qubits or couplers that are not usable. And then even more for quantum computing systems based on superconducting qubits, particularly tunable coupler superconducting architectures, it's not the case that every frequency, so I mentioned earlier that a superconducting qubit can be thought of as a tunable frequency oscillator. not at every frequency is its performance good. So you can create a graph which shows essentially the lifetime of the qubit versus frequency, and you'll find there are notches in it. There are certain places where it just does not perform very well. And worse, those notches move. So you can tune up your quantum computer and then come back and the computer has changed and you need to tune it up again. So there's a constant process of tuning up your quantum computer to make sure it's avoiding frequency spaces where it does not perform well, parts of the computer that don't work well in the first place, and then always coping with the inherent decoherence of the system and crosstalk of the system. So many, many challenges to build a very accurate quantum gate.
So for superconducting qubits, do they need to be as close as possible in terms of parameters, or you can still
you can certainly have variation.
let's say deal with that and like, okay, have slightly different frequency transitions for...
You can certainly have different frequencies. Superconducting qubits are definitely not identical. It's nice to be able to control what they are, but they're definitely not identical. And every single qubit and coupler has a significant number of control parameters that get tuned up to make the gates work, to make the qubits idle well. So yes, they're absolutely non-uniform and require detailed characterization before you can use them and achieve high fidelity computation.
Is it more like statistics on the fabrication side? Because there has been like, a long history of this development of the Moore's law, inheriting it from electronics, and even what we see here, like those chips what are made, I think it's a miracle. Do we still have the capacities to improve the fabrication tolerance?
We do definitely have the capacity. It should be stressed that a normal transistor-based chip and a quantum chip, specifically say a superconducting qubit chip, are very, very different things made in very, very different ways. So it's not immediate that you can leverage everything that's been done with regular computer chips and transfer it over to superconducting chips and suddenly have incredible reliability. There's a lot of research that's done on the materials, the recipes, exactly how the chip is designed such that from an architecture point of view, it doesn't have excessive decoherence, crosstalk, and other issues. One simple example of the variability is that in the superconducting qubits that we worked on at Google, you would have aluminum traces and then you would have aluminum oxide between them. And the properties of the qubit can depend exponentially on how thick that aluminum oxide is. So it can be very difficult to control the parameters of the qubit because it's very difficult to control the thickness of that oxide layer. Also, the area of that little patch of oxide is very small, and if there are defects, two-level systems in that patch, then that can cause a very significant change in the behavior of the qubit. So many things that are in principle very small, from a thickness to a small defect, can lead to very significant differences in the performance of the qubit, all of which makes it extremely difficult to make a qubit that is uniform, make 100 qubits that are uniform.
And do you include that a priori information about the physical qubits into the surface codes which you implemented on it?
It's not necessarily into the surface code, it's into how the gates are run on the device. So the device needs to know how to do, for example, a good single qubit gate, how to do a good 2-qubit gate. Those good gates require a lot of knowledge about how the qubit has been built, its parameters, its performance in every way. It does not necessarily mean that we ignore all details. It's certainly important to have a good handle on the high-level error rates of each qubit and gate. That information can certainly be fed into the surface code decoding to make it work better. If you know for a fact that a particular gate is not very good, then telling the decoder that will help it decode well. But many of the very low-level details, no, those do not go into the surface code, just the high-level error.
So basically, you also collect information for gates between every single, like let's say for 2-qubit gates, between every pair of the qubits on the chip.
One of those needs to be tuned up. It's a lot of tuning up. You, of course, try to do these things in parallel. It's not the case that you need to do these one by one across the chip. If the chip is big enough, you can choose pairs of qubits and pairs of gates and tune them up in parallel. And that's, of course, necessary. The last thing you would want is a many thousand or million qubit computer where you had to tune it up serially. But yeah, these are local quantum systems, local interactions, so you can parallelize it. Choose a qubit, and then beyond a certain range, it will not have a significant effect on a qubit, and then that one can be tuned up in parallel.
Does it also, these parameters, they change over time?
They can. Yeah, they can. Especially, I mean, I gave an example of the fact that qubits perform differently at different frequencies. That property can change with time. And so there's research that goes on to try to find architectures, substrates, fab protocols that lead to more stability. And then also in parallel to that, ways of doing the tune-up that are faster and could in principle be interleaved with computation. So, ideally you want the computer to be running all the time, not have to take it down and do an expensive long-term recalibration every now and then. But there are good ideas to do that, and it's certainly feasible that a future large-scale quantum computer running for not minutes but hours or days can at the same time take the necessary measurements to tune itself up on the fly and keep it working in good order. Still lots of work to make that real.
All right. So the noise models for the purpose of error correction is far less detailed than the physical processes.
That's correct.
And do you feel like right now this is for most purposes for error correction, this is enough? Like the way quantum error correction thinks about noise versus how noise actually happens physically.
Yeah, so there is essentially a two-level process. First, you work very hard on the hardware to try to make sure that unusual errors that quantum error correction cannot handle are mitigated at the hardware level. And then once you've done everything you can, you will be left with some amount of error just on the qubit. That remaining error can be exponentially suppressed using error correction. But it is absolutely necessary to have that two-step process. Many quantum architectures involve quite exotic quantum systems that have quite exotic errors. It's not the case that all of those types of errors are compatible with being corrected using error correction, so you must start there with the actual device.
There's a lot of complexity in compiling logical quantum circuits to a fault-tolerant hardware architecture, and I think in a big sense, this is in some way the part of the quantum stack that is not broadly understood, or at least its complexity is not as well appreciated as, for instance, some of the higher level ideas like transpilation to logical circuit or describing a quantum algorithm into quantum circuits. I feel like these are, especially in the era of NISQ, people become very comfortable with just writing down a circuit and think that that's the final thing. But I think yeah.
There's nothing wrong with being comfortable with NISQ if you can find quantum hardware that can run enough qubits and enough gates well enough that you get an answer that matters. Right? Just my personal level of hope that is the case is very low. It seems very difficult to build, a system with, say, 1,000 physical qubits where the error rate's 10 to the minus 5 level. If humanity could do that, I would say it would be quite embarrassing if we couldn't do something at the NISQ level that worked better than a regular computer. But those numbers seem, at the moment, who knows what the future holds, very tough to achieve. Maybe, if you give ion traps enough years of research, maybe if Microsoft gets Majorana fermions working, maybe those can be such low error rates. But at the moment, we don't have qubits that achieve such low error rates. So for those reasons, particularly given the field of quantum computing has been around rather a long time, it doesn't seem very likely that NISQ will be the thing that truly provides value, but it would be very nice if it did, because a NISQ quantum computer would be very, very much cheaper than a fault-tolerant quantum computer. So,
yeah. And maybe you can speak to some of the complexities of compiling from a logical circuit to a fault-tolerant architecture in the case of error-corrected quantum computers. The need on the software side that needs to happen in parallel to the hardware development.
Yeah, so complexities and just additional overhead. One of the first things that ceases to be cheap when you go to a fault-tolerant compilation is your single qubit rotations. So when you have raw qubits, these are very cheap. When you go to fault-tolerant qubits, you have to discretize your rotations into a sequence of gates that approximates the rotation you really want. And this is very, very expensive. So that's one. So you end up with a limited set of gates, typically Clifford gates, so gates that are easy to simulate using a classical computer, and then a handful of rotations that give you universality, in particular a small angle phase rotation called the T-gate, or in addition to that, a 3-qubit gate where you flip one of the bits if the other two are 1 at a Foley gate. So generally speaking, the first step is you compile your algorithm to a collection of Clifford gates, T-gates, and Toffoli gates. Already that will have blown up the gate overhead. And then you need to work out how to implement those fault-tolerantly. At the moment, the pathway we use in the TQEC community is you convert your quantum circuit into what's called a ZX graph, and then there are many rules that you can apply to the ZX graph to compress it, and then you take your compressed ZX graph and turn it directly into ladder surgery. Then you take the ladder surgery and turn it into physical level gates as appropriate for your hardware, its error rate, and how reliable you want that logical computation to be. So it's a multi-step process.
And there are aspects that depends on the specific fault-tolerant architecture.
Very much so. You know, if you have a 2D grid of qubits with nearest neighbor interactions only, then what I just described is the appropriate thing to do. If you have mobile qubits, if they have long-range interactions, if you have a completely different architecture that has some medium-range interactions, then other options become available to you, and that is arguably not the best thing to do. So absolutely, definitely, the right error correction code and fault-tolerant protocol depends very much on the underlying architecture.
And for a given application, or even for something as simple as an addition arithmetic circuit, how much difference would it make in terms of this leaky abstraction, where if you were to consider the architecture details of how you implement the circuit versus a sort of black box approach where you just use a generic way to compile these? How big of a difference would there be in this kind of leaky abstraction?
So let's perhaps give a very concrete example. Let's imagine you have a compiler designed for a chip with a 2D array of qubits and nearest neighbor interactions only, and then you go and use that compiler to run code on a computer that has arbitrary interactions. So you don't take advantage of any of that. How much have you left on the table in terms of optimization? Well, the first thing to note is that if we consider just a simple logical CNOT gate, when you implement it on a nearest neighbor architecture, that can require many, many rounds of error detection, many different patches of the computer, and it can be very high overhead. Whereas on a computer with arbitrary interactions, at a minimum, you could just take 2 patches and then interact them in a single round transversely. So you can leave a couple of orders of magnitude of overhead saving on the table already just doing that. And that's not the end of where it goes, because if you're still using the surface code on a computer with arbitrary range interactions, then you've neglected the ability to use block codes, many of which have savings well in excess of another order of magnitude on top of using the surface code. So it's not inconceivable that by being lazy with your compiler, you could leave 3 orders of magnitude on the table. So you really, really must tailor your compilation to your hardware. It's not optional.
So when we speak of, for instance, problems like factoring, it is possible, so there are resource estimates for factoring on 2D surface code. But I think what to extrapolate from what you just said is that there's probably an error bar of at least a couple order of magnitude that you can attach to that if we were to consider the same resource estimation across all possible
That's correct. Yeah, so as of now, it's approximately 1 million qubits to factor a 248-bit integer. So that is the latest work from Google, specifically from Craig Gidney. There is no reason to believe that couldn't come down by at least another order of magnitude, maybe 2, if you allow yourself arbitrary range interactions, because you have so many more options, so many more tools to play with. I have not seen that done in detail, but it's certainly a problem asking to be analyzed in detail.
Yeah, that probably requires very powerful software tools to automate a lot of the.
To be
tasks.
clear, most of these compilations and statements of overhead are done at a very high level. They're not necessarily worked out in full detail, but certainly what we hope to do within our community, the TQEC community, is provide tools that go all the way down to the gates, no missing features. So both you can get a true accurate overhead estimate and you can actually run the computer once you've done that.
Is there an example that you can show that, for instance, in how TQEC envisions this kind of fully detailed compilation?
Sure. And we have run a logical CNOT gate on Google hardware. That is the biggest fault-tolerant computation that can be currently run on Google hardware. So 105 qubits is enough to support 4 minimum size logical qubits. And if you choose 2 of them, you have space for an ancilla that can mediate a CNOT gate between those 2 logical qubits. We would need a much bigger computer to drive the error rate of that logical CNOT gate down low enough that it was better than doing it physically. So, doing an algorithm NISQ is still definitely the cheapest way to get the maximum performance out of current hardware. We're a long, long way away where it is better to turn on fault tolerance if you want an answer that makes any difference to anyone.
Right. And on that topic, what do you think? What the lessons that we can learn from running these NISQ experiments? How does that help us build better fault-tolerant quantum computers?
Sure. People work really hard to reduce the gate count and increase the utility of quantum algorithms to run things in NISQ. That's generically useful research, right? The quest to do something useful without error correction will definitely help when we do have error correction, because we will have found many small compact algorithms to run. So it's certainly not a different goal. We just want to run complex algorithms using the minimum number of gates. Just note what I said earlier, where if you start with a NISQ algorithm, you then have to convert it into the gate set that you actually can do error correction on, and then there's a whole series of steps beyond that to convert it back into physical level gates that you run on your quantum computer. But it's totally not research that will ever be thrown away. Anything done in NISQ lays the foundation for doing it fault-tolerantly.
And there's a sort of a distinction in objectives. For instance, in NISQ, a big concern is to reduce the depth of the circuit. In the case of fault tolerance, perhaps you will be more concerned about the number of non-Clifford gates. And I wonder how that will actually play out, like if
shape the circuits,
right,
and different constraints.
I would say probably even more critical than the number of non-Clifford gates is the maximum number of logical qubits required at any point in time in the algorithm. Because if that number is too big, you definitely can't fit the algorithm onto the quantum computer in the first place. Whereas with the non-Clifford gates, provided you have enough space for all of your logical qubits and they're long-lived enough, then you can take your time with the non-Clifford gates and still implement the algorithm. So that's the key resource, just lack of qubits to represent enough quantum information. And when it comes to any specific gate, such as the non-Clifford gates, you can always, if you wish, take more time. So that's not the bottleneck.
Yeah.
But if you want to have 200 logical qubits and the maximum your architecture can support is 100, you're going to have to go back to the drawing board and see if you can get away with half that number of logical qubits before you can even try.
You mean at the algorithm level to see if there's some innovation?
That's right.
So you have already mentioned about the TQEC. Mm-hmm. Is this something what you're working on these days?
That's my main focus these days. So it's a large open source community, and that is plenty to keep me busy.
Maybe, yeah, if you could share on the latest and greatest in the TQEC is the topological.
That's right, yeah.
Quantum error
Topological
correction.
quantum error correction, working on a full stack compiler for the Surface code to give us a baseline to compare with other architectures and other codes. Right? We need more compilers, not just TQEC, but more compilers where these comparisons can be done in an informed manner, taking into account all details of the code chosen and the architecture chosen. So very specifically, our goal is to build a compiler that anyone can use that gives them a state-of-the-art overhead for the Surface code. There are many, many works out there where people will say, oh, here is the overhead of my algorithm using the Surface code, but if you have a look at how they have compiled, it is very, very far from optimal. With the Surface code, a very common mistake is that people will take a sequence of fault-tolerant gates and just implement them one by one by one on a Surface code architecture. A very common mistake is that these one by one gates are applied to a forest of logical qubits that are spread out with hallways to enable interactions. This leads to an enormous waste of physical qubits and time, and can be done very, very much better with more advanced techniques based on mapping the circuit to a ZX graph and then realizing that ZX graph directly in ladder surgery. This is far and away very different to one gate at a time compiling. So there are compilers out there that have focused on speed and handling very large algorithms as opposed to getting anywhere near good compilation. And TQEC takes the opposite route. We acknowledge that existing computers are very small, that in many cases you can afford to hand compile and provide good tools to hand compile that are still not very difficult to use. Compilation using TQEC can, if you wish, look like manipulating a SketchUp program. Right? Build a three-dimensional structure of the software, export it to a DAE file, import that into TQEC, and TQEC will work out all of the gates to then run it on your computer. And for a long time, that will be a totally valid way to hand compile an algorithm because the computers themselves will not be big enough that anything more complex than that is even required. So our general design philosophy is to focus on the hardware that exists and make sure our software can do as close as possible to optimal compilation for those pieces of hardware.
So, and you said it's an open source project, but are there any other maybe like competing projects or a similar type of functionalities like implemented? Maybe like, I don't know, like I know Steam for for stabilizers.
So we use STIM. STIM is actually our current output format. Our goal is to really tie together the ecosystem of open source tools that are out there. So, if people want to start with Qualtran or Circ or Qiskit or Project Q, if you start with that, the idea is that you can choose your favorite algorithm specification tool, create an output file, input that file into TQEC, and it will take care of all of the remaining details for the moment to get you to a STIM file that you can either simulate or run on your quantum computer. And as time goes by, we will replace the STIM file with something that has feed forward. At the moment, a STIM file is sort of a static computation. Once it's specified, nothing that happens in the computation changes the computation. That's not enough for universal quantum computation. We need an output format where you can take a group of measurements, correct them, take the parity, and based on that parity, determine whether you do things in the future or not. Plus, all sorts of other features that we want in that output file to make sure it's not too enormous. You don't want to have to specify every quantum gate, for example. We would like an output format that is much more lightweight and yet can still be executed on a real quantum computer. So yeah, there's research to be done at that level. When it comes to competitors, I see them as alternative parallel compilation paths. So, anyone that's working on compiling something to the Surface code should be someone we can talk to and say, hey, this part of what you're doing looks really good. Let's make that one of the pathways in the compiler. And then when someone comes to compile it, it's work that gets used and you just choose the best possible outcome. So, I don't look at anyone working on a Surface code compiler as a competitor. these are potential collaborators. And the goal is to make sure that we all collaborate together to make maximum speed progress and produce the best possible, most performant tool.
How does TQEC accommodate this sort of leaky abstraction that we talked about? If someone really wants to squeeze out every bit of resource from a fault-tolerant quantum computer, does TQEC provide more than, for instance, an input file and an automation, and then there's more bells and whistles under the hood to play with?
At the moment, the output of the TQEC compiler is a generic circuit, not tied to a specific architecture. In general, that is enough to run things on specific architectures, because anyone that works with hardware will have their own procedure for taking an abstract quantum circuit and executing it on their hardware. So it is not the intention that the TQEC community gets excessively involved in the low-level details of every possible architecture. It is, in my mind, much more appropriate that those very low-level details are handled by the people that work with the low-level hardware. And that is, again, typically the case. Someone that is running a NISQ-style algorithm on hardware will already have a compiler of some sorts that takes a generic quantum circuit, maps it to the gates that are available on the hardware, and ensures everything is tuned up and running well. So it's not as though we need to duplicate that work. We have a very strong philosophy of don't duplicate work that already exists. Use it, make an interface with it, don't duplicate it. So finding output formats that people can consume is much more the focus than trying to go all the way to pulses. I mean, that would be not a great idea in my opinion, because there are already people on each type of hardware that have done that work.
And how did this effort begin?
This effort began when I gave a talk in Munich. So there's the Munich Quantum Software Forums 2 years ago from October. I actually spoke at the forum, it's the third time running, just earlier in October. So I gave a talk about the need for a compiler, the fact that one didn't exist, and how that was kind of ridiculous nearly 30 years into the quantum computing field, that we still don't have good high-quality compilers to work out what is the true cost of running an algorithm on a quantum computer. How can you do side-by-side comparisons if you don't have a good compiler? And I invited people just to contact me. Hey, let's work together, let's solve this problem. And people did contact me, and the TQEC repository was born. And then it has been a continual process. Then there was the Coursera course that drew in a lot more people. The second, last year, talk at the Munich Quantum Software Forum, where we talked about our first year of progress, invited yet more people to join, and now third talk, the same is planned. So we have many collaborations in progress with many different groups working on different aspects of compiling at different levels, and the goal is to really tie all that into a coherent whole that is time efficient for everyone, is available for everyone, and can do state-of-the-art research.
That's fascinating.
And was this your 100% focus from the get-go, that you feel like this is something you really want to do?
Yeah, I mean, obviously while I was at Google, I had many other responsibilities in addition to this, but it grew to become what I wanted to focus on full-time. And fortunately or unfortunately, Google decided that was not what they wanted me to focus on full-time, and hence I now do focus it on full-time, but I'm not at Google. No regrets, I do it all over again. I understand why they made the decisions they made. I just wish they felt they didn't need to make those decisions. Ultimately, they felt it was a business risk to run a collaboration with everyone. I had hoped they would be willing to take that risk, but they have their constraints. It's a very big company.
Yeah, and I think it's about export control.
Yeah. Export control fundamentally is what made it too risky for Google to support truly open source work. They were concerned that they might get in trouble, and they didn't want to risk that at any level. As it turns out, we have Zapata Quantum and Young Basile. These are two entities. Zapata Quantum works in quantum computing and funded Young Basile to look into the export control laws, and it was found that provided you are not doing defense-related work, provided you're not doing cryptography-related work, provided you are doing fundamental research and the work is free and open to everyone, you're actually totally fine when it comes to export control. I wish that that had been a conversation I could have had while still at Google, but it's okay. The conversation's been had, the clarity has been achieved. I'm free to focus my energy on TQEC without judgment, and I am very, very happy to be doing so.
Yeah. So the project is in the clear,
Yeah.
so to speak.
There were a couple of months that went by where it was not known, and I had to take a step back and not do any quantum until such time as that was clarified. But yeah, we're now all clear, and as mentioned, anyone anyway, very welcome and totally in the clear to do the work.
So for TQC, how do you see it like rolling into the future in terms of the next like milestones or?
Sure, we have a clear list of features we need to implement. We are still working on some of the details of implementing Hadamard gates. We're still working on some of the details of implementing S gates. There's a lot of work that needs to be done to properly implement T gates. We still need to even begin the work required to properly compile topology gates using the surface code and do all of that in an automated manner. There's a lot of work that needs to be done to make the compiler streaming as opposed to static, feed forward as opposed to no feed forward. So, we have a lot of clear milestones that we're working towards. More people help us get there quicker. Beyond that, even when all of that is up and running, then the focus will turn to the more complex architectures I mentioned, non-monolithic 2D nearest neighbor, 2D nearest neighbor with medium range interactions, mobile qubits, long range interactions, etc. All of which requires very substantially their own compilers, because you're going to use completely different codes and computation techniques.
I'm surprised at how long we've gone without talking about AI, because it seems like this is what everybody wants to talk about.
So it is interesting. In the last couple of months, we did have a contributor rely heavily on AI to generate their code for the repository. And, it's not bad code. It solves problems. They, in fact, were able to close a large number of issues quickly. But this is sort of right up to the minute. Within the community, we're still debating on how to handle such work. If someone uses AI, doesn't necessarily understand the code they've written, doesn't know how to appropriately construct tests, it can be the case that the AI code itself then consumes a lot of time of quite expert people to see what bugs it might have, what tests it does need. So if there's any clear guidance from someone who wants to use AI, if you do, please do take the time to understand the output, make sure it's appropriately tested, commented, and easy for a human to consume. Because if you don't do that, then someone else has to do that, and that can actually slow things down instead of speed things up. Will AI get to the point where it does everything wonderfully well? The code, the tests, the comments, who knows? It's not there yet. It's very good at solving specific algorithms and producing code, but not necessarily as good at creating something that is easy for a human to consume and understand.
Do you also see AI contributing to compilation? Like, let's say, instead of maybe more like algorithmic based, it's
absolutely
like,
right at the moment
models,
the
database.
compilation is algorithmic all the way down, but there is no reason why you couldn't look at various AI agents to look at different parts of the problem and use those tools to try to compile. Hasn't happened yet, but that's a very reasonable research direction.
So outside TQEC, right, I guess what advice in general you would have for people trying to find their research direction, find something that they genuinely love and they can stick to, like you did, right, for decades.
Like during a PhD, like when you were looking for the research topic.
Yeah.
You have a recipe.
I don't think it's that complicated. The first thing you should do is you should read research papers. So if you have an inkling of an area which you think you might be interested in, go and look up research papers in that area and see if when you read them, you are fascinated or you find it a grind. If you find it a grind, probably choose a different area. If you're fascinated and find yourself staying up late, working out all the details and really feel excited to be learning things that you just didn't know before, then perhaps you found something good. So number one, find an area that you enjoy reading, right? And anyone can do that. Find an area you enjoy reading. Number two, go and contact the researchers that you're reading. The average number of people that contact you after you spend months of your life producing a research paper is 0, right? Maybe 1. Be that one person, right? Go and ask an intelligent question of the researchers that did the research that you enjoyed reading, and ask them more. Is there anything I can help you with? I noticed this aspect, this piece of data. What about that? Could I clean up this project? Could I have a look at that? Be engaged, ask smart questions, and you'd be very surprised how open researchers are to talking, because most of the time no one contacts them, right? Once you have that, you have your way in, right? Whether that be becoming a grad student with them, whether it be not becoming any kind of student, but just getting on with the work. Right? There are lots and lots of opportunities to contact researchers and just get on with doing the research. It doesn't have to be a huge multi-year project to get into the industry. You will need some skills, but you may already have those. Particularly in quantum computing, if you can code, you already have valuable skills. You just need to find a problem that can be reduced to something that can be described succinctly that you can get your teeth into. Right? And there are many, many such problems. So, find something you think is cool, read it, contact the researchers responsible, chat with them, try to find a piece of the puzzle you can contribute to. It's certainly not the case that all problems are solved with a PhD. Right?
Right.
Fundamentally, a PhD is designed to teach you how to read papers, find a problem that's unsolved, network, and solve the problem. Produce your own research. There is absolutely no reason you can't do that without getting a PhD, right? Just go straight to the literature.
Well, also be next to those great people like John Martinez in your case,
Sure.
Lloyd Hollenberg.
If you want to do experimental physics as opposed to something involving programming, right, you will need an institution. You will need equipment, funding, and that's a heavier lift.
Environment. So observing this huge hype in quantum technologies and papers appearing almost every week, are there any, there's a lot of exposure of those works. Mm-hmm. But do you feel there are some papers or works which have been done, but they're kind of under the radar for most of the people?
Obviously, the vast majority of research in any field is under the radar. If you go just to the Quantum Archive, there's over 50 research papers a day, most of which no one will ever hear about outside the field. So yes, there's a huge amount of research that doesn't reach the public eye. Typically, the things that reach the public eye are quite distorted, and what the public thinks has been announced is not in fact what has been announced. So it gets quite twisted by the time it gets into the public domain. Some of the most exciting developments as a researcher in the field are in the area of block codes, so many logical qubits in not very many more physical qubits, and the better ways of compressing that information and computing on it efficiently. These are very technical papers, but in my mind represent one of the brightest beacons of hope that will build a quantum computer that is not so expensive that it's not worth building in the first place. You've got to reduce that overhead. So yeah, the last few months, for example, have been very exciting in that specific field, but you won't see any of that mentioned in the popular media because it's a bit too technical. What tends to get to the popular media are things that are easy to digest. A particular gate has been implemented very well. Popular media can understand that. A particular computation has been done so many times faster than what can be done classically. Again, this is easy to digest. It may not be true, but it's easy to digest. So a lot of unsung work goes on both experimentally and theoretically behind the scenes, and is often very, very much more important than the announcements you see that make it to the popular media.
By block code, do you mean code like LDPC code?
Yeah, and specifically in LDPC code where the goal is to take a certain number of logical qubits and encode them in the same code, as opposed to take one logical qubit, protect it with error correction, then another one, and do it separately. The surface code is technically an LDPC code, low density parity check, right? It does local parity checks. It is an LDPC code. It's just not a very efficient one in that it takes a lot of qubits to store a relatively low number of logical information. By contrast, there are things like what IBM has done, the gross code, where there is optimism that implemented well with high fidelity, you could save a factor of 10 in qubits. So, a dozen logical qubits in 10 times fewer physical qubits. So these are very promising codes to look at and see what it looks like when you start doing computation. What is the real overhead of the whole computation? Many papers, unfortunately, stop at the memory level. They say, oh, memory is much lower overhead. Great. What about computation? Right? Because ultimately you want a quantum computer, not a quantum memory. Quantum memory I can do by writing a quantum state on a piece of paper, sticking it in a library and waiting for centuries and it will still be there. Memory is not exciting. Computation is what we want. And then you have to go a lot further than just how many logical qubits fits in how many physical qubits. You have to look at how exactly do we access them, how exactly do we compute on them, how much space-time volume does that take? Is it actually lower overhead? Certainly in the early days of LDPC codes, the answer was no. It was not lower overhead. You would have a wonderful block code, and the very early papers would teleport a single logical qubit of information into a blank copy as big as the entire block. And then you would operate on it. Sometimes in the very early papers, you would then put it into the surface code and operate it. And so strictly speaking, the space-time volume of computation was higher than just using the surface code natively. The memory footprint was lower, but the computation space-time overhead was higher. Last few months have seen rapid progress in this area with people doing many parallel gates on block codes, lowering the overhead enormously. And in my mind, that is some of the most exciting research that is done currently in quantum computing. But yeah, definitely not public because it's complicated.
Yeah. But in some sense, it also feels natural because in the classical error correction field, almost every practical error correcting code is a block code.
Yeah.
And in that sense, do you see a lot of insights from classical error correction?
The short answer is maybe. In my mind, most codes in the classical world are block codes because most of the time when you need to use error correction, you're talking about communication. So you are sending data. So it really is memory, classical memory. Under normal circumstances, when it comes to computation, that memory is going to be unpacked into regular registers, and then you're not using error correction. So in quantum, we have a different problem in that we need to use heavy error correction during computation. So these codes need to do a lot more than they need to do in the classical case. Now, that doesn't mean there's not the scope for inspiration from the classical case, but it's just a word of caution that the quantum case is very different.
What are the things that will be most exciting from your perspective to see, in the next year, in the next 5 years, 10 years out, right, in quantum computing that you'd like to see? Like if that happened, right, that will
justify the effort spent.
that would make quantum computing worth it.
Yeah.
It would be wonderful to see an international effort come together, right? That would be great. So if people at some point realize, this whole quantum computing thing is much harder than I expected. It's going to cost much more than I would like if we do multiple copies of the research. At the moment, in my mind, the world is doing, 50 times, 100 times the necessary amount of research, a lot of duplication. That would be fantastic, right? Quantum computing should be something that brings people together. It should not be something that generates lots of individualism at the country level or corporate level. It should be something that excites people to work together. So that would be great. With the TQEC community, we try to live by that example to make it clear that this works better. Everyone works together, everyone wins. And then, of course, just more maturity in the compiler space, because if you truly want to know if an architecture is good, or an algorithm is good, or an error correction code is good, you can't do that without a good compiler. And a good compiler can make orders of magnitude difference in terms of enabling people to make rational decisions about which tech to support or which areas would have the most impact to make a not doing very well architecture much better. It's really a compiler that lets you do that. So hopefully, as a community, we can get some really good compilers out, show people the power of teamwork, and then through doing so, encourage a few people on the hardware side, which is different, it's differently funded, it's not a trivial problem, to start investigating whether some multinational projects might be a sensible thing to do. And I strongly believe they are very, very sensible things to do. In a world of increasing tensions, anything we can do to decrease tension is a good thing. If we can get on board with collaborating openly, that's worth it, right? If you want to justify quantum computing, how about help people see that we're all in this together, we can all solve problems together. That would be worth it. The International Space Station was worth it as much for seeing each other as fellow scientists, fellow engineers, as any other dollar return. Same could be true for quantum.
Great.
Okay, great. That's the grand finale.
Yeah. We can wrap up.
Thank you, Austin.
Well,
Yeah. Thank you.
so I gave this talk this morning. It took me 2 hours. We were going to have the accelerated version, not the 2-hour version. So we want to compile an algorithm into things that run on the surface code. This is the general program flow. Any tool into a graph, into a 3-dimensional structure, and simulate it. This is the type of hardware that we currently focus on, superconducting qubits, anything where you're piping signals into a chip, 2D, nearest neighbor. These are the kinds of fidelities around the 10 to the minus 3 level for 1 qubit, 2 qubit, and measurement at this point in time, which is good enough to achieve exponential suppression. So as we go down here, we're accumulating logical error more slowly. So it works. What we then want to do is focus on the surface code, which is a particular way to use those qubits where every red square is detecting phase flips, every blue square is detecting bit flips. So this is the chessboard analogy. If you think about an arbitrary qubit error that still leaves you in some combination of 0 and 1, then those errors can be decomposed into combinations of bit flips and phase flips. So you only need to correct bit flips and phase flips to correct an arbitrary error on the qubit subspace, the 0 and 1 state. When it comes to the notation, we have a surface code that does these checks for bit flips and phase flips over and over again. And we can represent it as this 3-dimensional structure. This cube down here represents doing this quantum circuit, check for X and Z errors, D times. And then our notation switches to, we have a spacer. So this long prism is actually nothing, no space-time volume whatsoever. And then another D by block, which represents another D rounds of checking for errors. So this whole structure represents 2D rounds of memory. And the main takeaway is that our logical operators must stick to walls of the same color. So my logical operator X is red, sticks to red walls, goes all the way through. My logical operator Z, blue, blue to blue, goes all the way through. Neither is changed. This is an identity gate. It's memory. We can also do memory like this, because the same is true. My logical X operator gets dragged all the way through and unchanged. So does Z. And so this noodle is memory as well.
But time goes backwards?
Time can go in any direction. All that matters is that data came in one end and went out the other end. Data can come in this end and come out that end. The exact orientation of time does not actually matter.
So what does it physically mean, this going backwards and forward again?
When you have a 3-dimensional program like this, you have an option to slice it in any direction. If I choose for time to run up, then as I slice this sausage, what am I going to get? First, I'll get a slice that looks like this, which means go implement that circuit. And then a little bit later, I'll get a slice that looks like that again, but also this U-shaped slice, a big patch of lots of this. And then a little bit later, I'll get a slice that looks like 3 of these in separate places. And then a little square patch here and a rectangle here, and then just this slice. Just imagine you chopping a piece of salami, right? This slice over here, which will look like this again. Or time could go into the page, and I could slice my salami this way. And then what would happen is at the beginning of time, I'll have a rectangular piece of salami here and a U shape over here. And then a little bit later, I'll have just 2 square patches. And then a bit later still, I'll have one rectangular patch, and then I'm done. Either way, anyway, even if time runs left to right or right to left, by slicing it, you have a specific quantum circuit that you are implementing on your hardware, and it will do the same computation. Data in one end, data out the other. Because the logical operators are unchanged, it is an identity gate.
So the space and time seems to have this interchangeable quality where
That's
you
right.
can look at it in multiple
That's
ways.
right.
That's pretty cool.
And these are very deformable. I could take this U shape here, and I could flatten it down out the front. It would still be the same computation,
I see.
It's like symmetries.
provided you
Rotation.
preserve the topology of the sausage.
I
You
see.
get the same computation. Yeah. All that matters is how do logical operators in map to out. So any noodle,
See.
any shape is an identity gate.
And there's no, so what are the restrictions on how this can be bent? So this could be arbitrarily bent and it will be equivalent.
It's just respecting the colors. So for example, I can't take this piece and twist it so that red touches blue and blue touches red. You must preserve the consistent coloring. If I take a paintbrush and put it on the surface, I can run all the way around here and not take it off. So you have to preserve the coloring. Provided you do that, there is no restriction on how you can deform it. So you can create rules for, what does a C0 gate look like? And ultimately it looks like a blue node, sort of a blue junction connected to a red junction. And then the rest is arbitrary noodles that you can deform as you wish, provided it stays a blue node connected to a red node. And that's really just the beginning of what's possible. You can convert your circuit into a bunch of these blue and red nodes, and then you can get busy with rules. So we mentioned topological deformation. You can move this chimney over, which as a graph looks like nodes of the same color can be merged and split. So I can go and take this picture and take all of the nodes of the same color and merge them together. All of the nodes of the same color and merge them together. And when you play that game to its natural conclusion, you end up with this picture. So what looked like a very complicated quantum circuit can become a very simple graph. And then going back the other way, you can go and expand that very simple graph back into ladder surgery. So here is a four-way blue node realized in ladder surgery. And then you go and look at its neighbors, 2, 3, 4, each of which is a three-way red node, and you realize them directly in ladder surgery. And when you're done, you have a structure that is very compact indeed, but realizes the entire computation that is all of these gates. And this is what compilation should look like.
So each node turns into the like the surface.
Keep in mind that this is a fancy sausage that you can slice in any direction. I can make time run up, left, right, any direction whatsoever. The slices tell the computer what to do. Yeah.
Oh, just looking at the encoding between the numbers.
The numbers just give you a way to identify which node is which node on the graph.
Okay.
So it's easier to see which is which.
The nodes are the intersections on the right.
That's right. So you'll see 5 is a three-way blue node.
I see.
8 is a three-way red node. All right. So that's just to aid the checking that that is indeed a valid realization of that graph.
Is it easy to describe the connection to things like tensor networks and measurement-based quantum computing?
So the surface code is a form of measurement-based quantum computing, but in my mind, the purest way to visualize the software is as a three-dimensional structure like this. Given a three-dimensional structure like this, you can go to your hardware, you can ask yourself, what is my error model? You can ask yourself, how rapidly can I suppress error on my hardware? And therefore, how big do my surface code slices need to be? If we go back to the beginning, here is real hardware with real data in terms of how quickly it suppresses logical error. If you have a computation, you can work out the total area of all of the slices, yeah? And you can therefore know what logical error rate you're going to need per unit area to realize that computation. So that will set how big these cross-sectional regions are in the patch, yeah? Abstract geometry plus an architecture plus an error model for that architecture becomes a dimension of this square. And then once you have that, you choose your direction of slicing, and that turns it into layer by layer exactly what you need to do on your hardware to realize that computation.
I see. But how to interpret that if the time goes sideways, is then this also a patch of surface code?
Absolutely. I mean, if time went left to right, this blue face would represent, initialize this long rectangle all in the 0 basis. And then slice down here, you would have a rectangle of surface code. For example, here is a rectangular slice. Slice D is a long rectangular patch of surface code. Slice E, blue on the top, means measure out all of these in the Z basis because it's blue. So slice by slice, that structure has very concrete meaning in terms of how to implement it. As I say, structure plus architecture plus error model equals the appropriate size of surface to use and the specific circuit to use, which would then be mapped to the actual gates available in the hardware, which won't always be C0 and CZ gates, right? You actually need to use the available gates in the hardware. And when all of that is done, you have a real schedule on a real piece of hardware that implements this computation. And this has been done all the way down for the Google Willow chip, 105 qubits for a logical C0 gate.
How did you come up with such visual representation of the circuits?
I mean, it's a work of a community. The original lattice surgery paper has 4 authors. So it has Dominic Horstman as the lead author. I was the senior author. Simon Devitt was there. I apologize, there's one other author there as well. So these things are not done in a vacuum.
Which year was that?
That I would have to check. It's a while back. It will be earlier than 2010.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so these ideas have been around a long time.
I see.
The idea lay dormant for quite a number of years, the idea of lattice surgery, and it only became clear later just how flexible it was. In the beginning, it was all about, all right, I have 2 logical qubits next to each other. I can do an XX or a ZZ parity measurement. Great. Build everything out of those. And that's not super efficient. And it was only later that people realized, hang on, throw away the concept of parity measurement entirely. We have noodles. These noodles map logical operators. They affect computation. Just focus on the noodle map and you can get much, much lower overhead computation. Throw away the concept of a logical qubit, basically. If you have a look at this structure, it is not reasonable to say if I slice it through here that I have 1 logical qubit here, 1 logical qubit here, 1 logical qubit here. I mean, it's not reasonable. It's not a 3-qubit computation. It's a 7-qubit computation, produces a 7-qubit output state. All you need to focus on is the structure and how the outputs are related to one another. There's a concept of a correlation surface, which is basically what shows what computation you are doing. So for a simple C0 gate, a C0 is a gate that has the property that logical X on the control gets mapped to both outputs. Logical Z on the control goes straight through. Logical X on the target goes straight through. Logical Z on the target goes to both outputs. Anything that has that structure is logical C0. For the case of this rather larger computation that we look at, there are more complex correlation surfaces, and essentially if you looked at each one of these, there will be 7 of them. I have 7 outputs, so 7 correlation surfaces. Each one will define a stabilizer of the Steen code. This is a circuit that prepares in the surface code a logical Steen qubit made out of surface code, right? So you get 7 correlation surfaces, 7 stabilizers, and then you can go and simulate those and work out the reliability of their preparation. And that is ultimately the output of TQEC, a STIM file that you can either simulate or send to hardware and run the hardware. But it should be stressed that this structure can be rotated arbitrarily in space and time, and it will still produce the same state. So, these are the kinds of ideas that TQEC exists to make mainstream, right? There are still a lot of works where people say, here is my logical qubit, boom. Here is another logical qubit, boom. We've left some space between it so that we have space to do interactions. And that's really, really inefficient. We really want to socialize the state-of-the-art methods and get people coding a state-of-the-art compiler so that when people judge the surface code and say, I have done better, They know what they're talking about.
Right. And but this is not block code.
This is not a block code.
Right. But in some way, it achieves the same kind of compression or the same kind of more efficient representation of the operations.
Yeah, it's more, I would say, this graph represents how information propagates through this structure. And so you take the large computation and you boil it down to its purest form. What nodes do I need in a graph to describe the computation? And then you realize that computation very directly in lattice surgery. It's just the right way to do it.
And with, for instance, if we swap out surface code with some even more efficient block code,
Sure.
on top of this, how do you think these two would interact?
So there is work in this direction. Craig Gidney and others have worked on a thing called yoking, Michael Newman as well. They have put essentially additional checks on arrays of surface code logical qubits to effectively turn them into block codes that are more efficient. So you can indeed make block codes out of the pieces that are surface code, because if you think of what a surface code enables you to do, maybe go to a different one here. What is this circuit? Fundamentally, this circuit is measuring an XXXX stabilizer. That's what this measurement will tell you. We've initialized in an eigenstate of all Z, and then I measure a 4-body X stabilizer, another 4-body X stabilizer, and yet one more. And this prepares the logical state. You can do that in a different way. You can do it one C0 at a time. So here's the first C0 in there. Here is the second C0 in there.
Mm-hmm.
And then you can deform those. So that's still two C0s, squish them together, rearrange it. And this is a single control 2-target C0 gate. And if I can do the first two, well, why not do all 4? Which you can. And then you can go and have a look at this and use some rules where if I have Hadamard's entirely encircling a particular node color, then I can just swap the node color and get rid of the Hadamard. You can sort of look at this as if I have one of these yellow bands, this Hadamard gate, I'm allowed to remove the yellow band and twist the structure. So that's what we can do here, provided it's on every edge of a particular node. And since this is a single edge node, I can do it here. So I can untwist those. And then I have something topologically trivial that I can push in and push in and push in. And this is now a 4-body 4x stabilizer measurement in its purest form. So if you think about logical qubits and a block code, you can measure the low density parity check stabilizers of an LDPC code using structures of this form, and directly implement the long-range interactions using only local physical interactions. And provided these things don't get too long-range, then there is the chance that it might do things better. And in the particular case of yoking, there is a particular code that was chosen where you have kind of a global X and a global Z check, and this helps reduce the overhead of memory by up to a factor of 3. It's significant.
How can you read the memory footprint just off of this visualization? Maybe if you figure out the cross section, like direction where the cross section is the smallest, maybe is that the right way to read it?
So again, it depends on your target logical error rate. After all, if your target logical error rate is 50%, then you can use the smallest surface code, right? And they'll be full of errors, but you set the target. So it depends a lot on your target logical error rate as to how big the footprint has to be. Even in a single memory experiment, if I set the target logical error rate at 10 to the minus 12, I'm going to need a really, really big footprint, right? So number one controller of the memory footprint is what is your target logical error rate. Beyond that, if we're doing this trick of surface code with multi-level code on the top of it, LDPC code on the top of it, that LDPC code on the top is going to allow you to use smaller pipes, right? Because additional reliability comes from the fact you are doing checks at a higher level. So, and that's what happens with yoking. You add extra checks, and those extra checks allow you to use thinner pipes everywhere.